In this video, we're going to discuss Structured Query Language, or SQL. SQL allows for a standardized way to communicate with a number of different relational databases using a standard language. While there are often slight variations on the SQL language for different databases, the basics of the SQL language remain the same. Some of the relational database management systems out there that can be interacted with using SQL are Microsoft SQL Server, which is used by many enterprise-level services, MySQL, which is an open source system that's easy to install and use, PostgresQL, which is another open source option and is good for managing more complex queries and large data sets, and it's also extensible, Mariadb, which is also open source and generally considered faster than MySQL, and Oracle, which is another large enterprise-level relational database. As mentioned, SQL is a language with a standard-based set of commands, such as select, insert, update, delete, create, and drop, for manipulating database objects and data. But there are different dialects that extend the language for specific database types. So if you're using a specific type of database, you should learn the specific SQL dialect. For instance, TransactSQL, or TSQL for short, is a dialect for Microsoft SQL Server, whereas PGSQL is specific to PostgresSQL, and PLSQL is specific to Oracle. Databases are also hosted in the cloud these days, and one example of that is Azure SQL on Microsoft's Azure Cloud Platform. These services extend the same SQL Server engine used by the traditional Microsoft SQL Server, but they're designed for serverless computing in the cloud. There's the Azure SQL database, which works as a backend for a modern cloud application. It's managed by Microsoft and can be spooled up in Azure in a couple of clicks. For more enterprise-wide solutions, there's also Azure SQL Managed Instance, which allows for scaling of many databases in the cloud. And there is also the SQL Server on Azure VMs, which is a popular way to take on-premises SQL Server instances quickly to the cloud in a strategy called lift and shift, which emphasizes minimal pain and effort when moving to the cloud. Now, the goal of today's cloud-based databases is to store massive amounts of data efficiently. There are some hurdles that developers will come across that must be overcome when managing databases. First off, incompatible platforms will slow developers down. In the case of Microsoft, they've offered services in Azure Cloud that minimize this pain when moving an on-premises SQL Server instance. The next problem, and this is one that I've heard customers complain a lot about, is inadequate data security. Customers have gotten used to the security of an on-premises SQL Server instance, and they may worry that moving to the cloud will offer less security for their data. Luckily, this is usually more of a perception problem than a real one, since today's cloud offerings are often as secure or more secure than the on-prem versions. Insufficient resources is something that companies face with on-premises databases. They may find the cost of managing their own resources too high, and this is actually a great reason to consider moving to the cloud, since resource management is then done by the cloud provider, and scalability is handled by the provider as well. When running a traditional on-premises database, it may become prohibitively expensive to pay for the resources for a database as it grows. As you buy new servers, you may find that some of your server capacity is wasted. Cloud providers can help here by offering database services in which you only pay for what you use and nothing more. In other words, your cost is no longer measured in servers, but instead on usage, which is more cost-effective. Cloud-based SQL applications such as those on Microsoft Azure offer many other advantages. Because the underlying resources are managed by the cloud provider, the provider can offer performance tuning, allowing your databases to perform optimally. Cloud providers can offer high availability, guaranteeing high uptime for your database. They often have built-in disaster recovery, which includes automated backups, so you don't have to manage backups yourself and worry about losing important data. Another bonus that moving databases to the internet affords your company is advanced threat detection that you might have difficulty managing on your own hardware. Built-in security controls that allow you to choose the level of security you need, and automatic adherence to certain compliance rules, such as what data can exist in which physical locations in the world. So there are many options for either running your databases on-premises yourself or relying on a cloud provider to manage them. But there are some base commonalities to all the SQL-based relational databases, and that's the basic SQL statement types. DML, or Data Manipulation Language, is the collection of SQL statements that allow you to manipulate records in the database. In other words, they manipulate the data itself. For instance, there's the insert statement, which inserts records, the update statement that updates existing records, the select statement that allows you to read records, and the delete statement that allows you to delete records. Then there's DDL, or Data Definition Language. This is a collection of statements that allow you to manipulate the objects in the database that store the data. For instance, you can use a create statement to create a database or a table. You can also use the alter and drop commands to alter and drop these objects respectively. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use Data Definition Language, or DDL, in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. What Data Definition Language, or DDL, is a language to create the structure to store your data in the database. So I'm going to show you how to create a schema, and a schema organizes other objects such as tables, views into tables, and stored procedures. So I'm going to run this first query that I've written here. Create schema test_schema is what I'm going to call my schema. And I'm running this on a database I already have created. If you look on the tree on the left under databases, I have test_db. So this is already existing. And notice also that I have square brackets around the name test_schema. So I'm going to highlight this create schema query, and in the toolbar I'm going to click execute. So in the window below the query, it says commands completed successfully. And if I go to the tree on the left and I go under test_db and I open up security, there's a subfolder that says schemas. And if I open that up and I'll right click on schemas and hit refresh, then I should see the schema I created, and here it is, test_schema. Now the next thing I'm going to show you is how to create a table within that schema. So I'm going to tab over to another query, and this is my create table query. So let's just step through this. The grammar here is create table, and in square brackets I have first the schema, and then a dot, and then in square brackets the name of my table, and I'm going to call my table users. So this will be a typical user table. In round brackets I have the fields defined. So the first field is called ID. It's an integer, so it's of type int, and it's not null, meaning that it's required for every row. So you cannot create a row in this table without giving an ID. The next field is first_name. It's a character field, so like a string, and I'm allowing 255 characters max. And it also is required, so it's not null. And I also have last_name, also a 255 maximum character string. That's not null, so it's required. I have an age field, which is an integer, and it's also required. And I have a field called hobby, which is a 255 character string as well. And you can see it's optional because I didn't put not null. So it doesn't have to be filled in, it can be null. And finally, at the end, I have primary key and in round brackets ID. That says what the primary key of the table is, and it's the ID. So that helps for searching in the table. And I end with a round bracket. So if I click execute in the toolbar, so if I go to my test_db in the tree on the left and I open up tables, you see my table, test_schema.users. And if I expand that and I expand columns, then I can see all of these columns. ID, first name, last name, age, hobby. So what I've done is I've created a table, so now I have something to store my data in. Okay, so the next query I want to show you is the drop table. So if we go to the drop table tab, I have drop table in square bracket test underscore schema, which is the schema, then dot, and then in square bracket the name of the table, users. Now before I do this, actually I want to show you something. I'm going to go to another one, which is drop schema. So this is drop schema test underscore schema. And I'm going to try to drop the schema when it has a table in it. So I'm going to click execute. Now I get an error at the bottom. In messages, it says cannot drop schema test schema because it is being referenced by object and it has an object. This object is the identifier of my table. What it's telling me is you cannot drop the schema until all of the objects in the schema have been dropped. So I'll go back to my drop table, and now I'll click execute on drop table. Now in messages, it says commands completed successfully. So if I go to the left to my tree and I go under test underscore DB tables and I right click and hit refresh, then you see the tables open up and my table is gone because I've deleted it. And now if I go back to drop schema and I click execute, so now messages says commands completed successfully. It's happy because the schema is empty, and schemas can only be deleted when they're empty. Now, on the left, under my tree, I'm going to go under Security Schemas. And if I right-click and hit refresh on my schemas, you can now see my schema is gone. Now, something to keep in mind when you're doing DDL commands is that they require elevated permissions. Now, I can run DDL commands on this database because I'm the owner. There are also DDL permissions that you can give to a regular user to allow them to do this. In this video, I'm going to show you some examples of DML, or Data Manipulation Language, in SQL. Now I'm in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio here, and I'm connected to an existing database called test_db. Now there's already a schema and a table set up, so let me just show you that. If I go to the tree on the left-hand side and I open up security and I open up schemas, I have a schema called test_schema. If I go to test_db tables, there is a table under that schema called test_schema.users. And if I expand that and I expand columns, you'll see that there's an ID, which is the primary key, and it's required, not null. First name and last name, both of these are strings or characters of a maximum 255 characters. They're both also required or not null. And there's an age that's an integer that's also required, which is not null. And then there's a field called hobby, which is a string of 255 characters max, and it says null, which means that it's optional. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to put data in this table and how to manipulate that data. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you a select statement, which actually doesn't manipulate the data, but allows us to see the data in the table. So in the query window that I have open right now, this is the query. It's select star from test_schema.users order by age. So the star or asterisk selects every field in every record in the table. If I click execute, down in the results window, I see the fields as columns and there's no data. So the table is empty. Now let's put some data in the table. So I'm going to go to a different tab here. I have an insert query. And the query you see right now, you'll see that it has 4 lines to it that are separated by spaces. Each one is an insert into statement. So the first one goes insert into test_schema.users. And in round brackets, it has the name of all the fields that we're inserting into. And notice that I don't insert into hobby in this example, since it's optional. And then I have the keyword values, and then round brackets, and the values that go into those fields. Now the order of the fields is important. the order of the fields in the first round brackets has to match the values in the second round brackets. So I have one for Bob Barker, I have one for Alice Brown, one for Nancy Drew, and one for Steve Smith. Notice their IDs are unique, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Because ID is a primary key, if I try to duplicate, it's going to give me an error. So I'll hit execute on the toolbar. And down in the messages window, you see one row affected, one row affected, one row affected, one row affected. So it's basically inserted 4 rows into the table. So if I go back to my select query, and notice my select query orders by age. I can order by any field that I want, and I can order ascending or descending. I'll show you that in a minute, but I'm just going to click execute on the toolbar. And down in results, you can see my records. There's Steve Smith, age 12, Alice Brown, age 45, Nancy Drew, age 66, and Bob Barker, age 78. Now, they're ordered by age, you see, from lowest to highest. If you look at the age column, 12, 45, 66, 78. By default, it orders ascending. If I wanted to order it the other way, descending from largest to smallest, I'll modify my query, and after age, I add the key DESC, which means descending. Now if I execute, now when I look at the results, the records are now in the order of oldest to youngest. Now that we've inserted records and we've selected them and seen them in the table, now let's update records. So this SQL statement updates a record and adds a hobby to only one record. It says update test schema.users set hobby equals horseback riding where first name equals Steve. So this is a conditional, and it's setting the field where the first name is Steve. So it'll set the field for every record where the first name is Steve. That just happens to be one record in the table. So let me click execute on this, and you see at the bottom one row is affected. Now if I go back to my select query and I hit execute, now when we look at the record for Steve Smith, age 12, the hobby is now horseback riding. So we've updated that record. Now I'd like to show you, if I go back to the update, I'm going to remove the conditional. And the way that you do that is you can add documentation in SQL by starting the documentation with /* and ending it with */. So that tells it to ignore that line. So now it's just going to update users, set the hobby equals horseback riding. I'm actually going to change this. I'm going to change the hobby to cross-country skiing. But since I don't have any conditional, let's see what happens. I'm going to hit execute. Now in the messages it says 4 rows affected. And if I go back to my select and I hit execute, you'll see that everybody's hobby changed to cross-country skiing. So if you don't have a conditional, it's going to change all of the records. The conditional tells it which records to modify. Now finally, we're going to delete records. So I have a query here to delete. Delete from test schema.users where, and I have a conditional, where age is greater than 45. So we're going to delete all user records where the age is greater than 45. I hit execute, and it tells me in the messages that I've now affected 2 rows. So if I go to my select query and I hit execute, I now see 2 of my rows have disappeared, and I still have Alice and Steve left because their ages are not greater than 45. Now if I want to delete all of the records, all I need to do is remove the conditional. So I'll do that now, and hit execute, and see it's affected another 2 rows in the messages. And if I go to select and hit execute, now my table is empty. So create, update, select, and delete are the main types of queries that you're going to use when you're modifying data. In this exercise, I'm going to show you how to create a SQL database in Azure, and I'm going to show you how to query it in Azure as well. So the first step is to create our SQL database. So I'm going to click Create a Resource on my home page. And I can search for it, but I see it right here. There's SQL Database. I'm going to select that. And I'm on Create SQL Database. Now, on the basics, I just have to select a resource group. Now, you can create your own resource group if you're doing this yourself. I've already got one called Database. I have to give it a database name, so I'm just going to call this TestDB. And then I have to select a SQL server. Now, I don't have one yet, so I'm going to click Create New. And I have to give it a globally unique server name under New Server. So I'm going to just call this Test Server 26. And server admin login, I have to give it a unique, this is a username for my administrator. So I'm going to call myself bbrooks26. It's my standard admin login. And for password, you can give it any password you'd like. And then choose a location. Okay, so I've chosen Canada Central for the location. So I'll click OK. And now I can click Review and Create. And keep in mind, if you do this yourself, this does cost some money per month to run. I'm just going to hit Create. And now the deployment is in progress. So I'm probably going to step ahead here because this will take a few minutes. Okay, and my deployment is complete. Now that actually took a few minutes. I paused the video. So if you're doing this on your own, it's going to take a few minutes for that to come back. Now I can click Go to Resource, and it'll take me right to my test database. Now where I can query this database is on the left here. It says Query Editor, and this is a preview, but you can click on that. It'll ask you to log in. Now if I log in as SQL Server Authentication, then this is the credentials that I entered when I created the SQL database. So my login is bbrooks26, and I'll just enter the password that I put in. Okay, and I'll click OK. So you're now at a query editor, and you can see there is a tree that shows you tables, views, and stored procedures. And there's also a query window on the right. So I can do things like, let me create a table really quickly. So create table, test table. Here, I'll put square brackets around that. And I will give it a simple ID and a name. And if I hit run, query succeeded. Now if I click the little refresh on the left-hand side and I open up the table section, I now see my table. So this is a good way to test your queries and just see if they work by using Azure directly using Query Editor. In this exercise, I'm going to show you how to use Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio to connect to an Azure SQL database. So I have Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio open, and if I go to File and Connect Object Explorer, I get the Connect to Server window. Now, in order to connect to an Azure SQL database in the cloud, what I need is a qualified server name for that cloud database. So I'm going to go to Azure for that. So let me open up the Azure portal. And in the Azure portal, if you have your own Azure portal, your SQL database might be somewhere else, but mine is in a resource group called Database. So I'll open that up. And I've already created a SQL Server instance in a SQL database. And if I click on the SQL database, mine's called TestDB, then in the overview for TestDB for my SQL database, there is a section that says Server Name. That's the name that I want to give to Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So if I go back, and under Server Name, I'll paste that name. Now for authentication, I'm going to use SQL Server Authentication. And when you set up your SQL database in Azure, you would have created an administrator username and password. And that's what you enter here. Or if you have another user set up on that database, you could enter it here as well. my administrative login is called bbrooks26, and I'll put my password in and hit connect. And that's really all there is to it. It should connect via the internet to the cloud and connect to your database. So here I have actually two open. I'm just going to close the one that I'm not using. Disconnect. The one that I've just opened is right here, testserver26.database.windows.net. And if I expand databases, I see I already have a database. As you recall, my database was called TestDB. And here it is. So the root of this tree represents my SQL Server instance, and the database associated with that SQL Server instance, TestDB, is underneath it. If I open up tables, I have no custom tables. So I can create a table. Let me go up to the toolbar and click New Query. And a new query window appears at the right. And I will just create a table. Create table, test_table. And I will give this a few fields. I will give it an ID field, and just for argument's sake, a name field. And if I click execute in the toolbar, so down in my messages it says commands completed successfully. Now if I go back to the tree on the left and I right click on tables and click refresh, then you'll see my table here, test_table. And if I open it up, I see the columns are the fields that I created, ID and name. So in conclusion, I've shown you that as long as you have the server name and credentials, it's very easy to connect to Azure SQL Database using Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. In this exercise, I'm going to show you how to use Azure Data Studio, which is a client that you can run right on Windows 10, to access a SQL database in Azure. So the first thing is to download the Azure Data Studio. So I'm just on a website here. So on the web, if you go to Microsoft Docs and you search for download and install Azure Data Studio, you should be able to find this site. And it has a section called Get Azure Data Studio for Windows. And what you need to do is the link I'm showing here, Azure Data Studio User Installer for Windows. So you want to download that exe and you want to run it. And that will install this locally for you. Now I've already done that, so I'm just going to start the application. Here's Azure Data Studio. And the first thing I want to show you is on the left-hand side we have a connections section, and it has two subsections, servers and Azure. There's actually two convenient ways that you can connect to your database. We'll look at the first one, servers first, and this just allows single connections to any servers, and they don't even have to be Azure servers. They can actually be any valid SQL Server instance. So I'm going to click Connection, and on the right I get a Connection Details window, and I need to fill in a server. Now, if it's an Azure SQL database, then you go to Azure, and I'm on the Azure portal here, and go to your database. Now my SQL database is called TestDB. I'm going to open it up, and on the overview page of TestDB of your SQL Server database, there's a server name, and that is what you want to copy. Now if I go back to Azure Data Studio, I just have to paste that name in to the server name. Now for authentication type, I'm going to choose SQL Login. And you need to give it a valid SQL login. Now, when you create your SQL database, you would have had to create an admin username and password, so you can use that. So mine is bbrooks26, and I'll put in my password. And hit Connect. Now it connects. Under servers on the left, you see I now have my test server 26. That's my Azure SQL database. And if I open up databases on the left, I see the one database I already have existing called TestDB. And if I expand that and expand tables, I have a table called test_table. So I have some data in there, and I'm just going to query it. So I'm going to create a new query. And at the top here, I have a database selector. My test table is in TestDB, so I will choose that. And I will choose select star from test_table. And click run. And at the bottom, I see the data from my table. I just have some IDs and names in here. So Bob, Barker, Nancy, Drew, Alice, Cooper. So that shows how you can access your database and query it just as a single database. Now another way you could do it, and I'm just going to close this query, and I'm going to disconnect from the server, and then I'm going to delete the connection. Another way I could do it is in the tree on the left, you have an Azure section. And I can click the little plus on Azure and I can sign into Azure. What this will do is it will give me access to all the databases that I have in a given Azure account. So that can be useful. So I click Add an Account on the right, and it will take me to a browser and ask me to log in, so it knows which Azure account to use. So I'll choose my Azure account, and it says your account was added successfully. Now if I go back to Azure Data Studio, you see under linked accounts on the right, I now have my account. And if I click close, on the left under Azure, my account is now linked with Azure Data Studio. So when I open it up, I can see the subscriptions I have, and I can see all of my databases, not just SQL Server and SQL Database, but other ones as well. So if I open up SQL Database, I see my TestDB, and it says login failed for my user. On the right-hand side, I have to enter my password again. And just for convenience, I'll click Remember Password, because otherwise it will keep asking me. So it's connecting. And now I see my tables, and there's my DBO test_table. So I can now click New Query on the right, just like I did before. At the top, I can choose TestDB, and I will do the same query. And I run, and there's the same data. So using Azure Data Studio, what I've shown you is that there's actually two ways you can connect. You can connect to individual servers using a server name and credentials, or you can also connect via an Azure account. And what that does is it gives you access not just to SQL databases, but to other types of databases. And it gives you access to all the databases that are under that particular account. In this exercise, I'm going to show you how to use a utility called Sql Command, or Sql CMD, in order to access an Azure SQL database. Now the first step is to install Sql Command. So here on Microsoft Docs, just search SQL CMD utility. And when you get to this page, there's a section called Download the latest version of Sql Command utility. So download either the x64 or x86 for Windows, whichever one makes sense for your system, and run that MSI to install Sql Command if it's not already installed. Now I've already done that, so I'm going to switch to a command prompt. So to use Sql Command, the interesting thing about Sql Command is it's a command prompt. And the nice thing about that is that you can use it in scripts. So it's a way that you can automate database calls. Because any batch file or script you can run, you can call a command prompt and run Sql Command statements. So the first step is to sign into my Azure SQL database using Sql Command. So I'm going to write a command here, sqlcmd space -S, that stands for server, and I have to give it the server name. So to get your Azure SQL database server name, just go to the Azure portal and open up your SQL database, and mine is called TestDB. And on the overview, there's something called server name, and just copy that. Now go back to the command line and paste that in as your server name. Next one is -d, and that stands for database, space, and this is the database that you'd like to open. So I have a database called TestDB that's created on this SQL Server instance called test-server26. And then space, and then -U, this is my username, space, and my username is bbrooks26. When you created your SQL database in Azure, you would have had to create an admin username and password. So you could use that here. And that's what I'm using. Space, and then I need to give it a password. So -P, space, and I type in my password. And I hit enter. So now I get a 1 and an arrow underneath. So that means that I'm logged in. And I can now issue queries to the database. So for instance, I can say select star from, and I happen to have a test table called test_table that has data in it. So I say select star from test_table, hit enter. Now it didn't do anything. It gives me another line with a 2, so it's a second line. Now, in order to run this, you can do batch. So you can create a bunch of statements here, and all you have to do is issue the command go afterwards and hit enter. And you see that it now runs my select statement, and I now have my data. It shows the column names at the top, ID and name, and I have 3 rows. ID is 0 for Bob Barker, ID is 1 for Nancy Drew, and ID is 2 for Alice Cooper. Now to finish here, I can just type exit, or I could keep going. I could do more statements, but I'm just going to go exit, and that logs me out of my SQL database. So as I mentioned, SQL Command is very useful because you can run any sorts of queries that you would normally run, and because it's command line, it allows you to add these to scripts and batch files which you can run once in a while, and you can actually automate things. So for example, if you say wanted to run a script that deletes old records from a database at the end of every week, say every Friday, you could actually put that on a Windows schedule, and you could actually run a script which would log in and run some queries to clear off old. So in this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to deploy a PostgresQL database in Azure and query that database using Azure Data Studio. Now, if you're not familiar, PostgresQL is an open source database that offers advanced features for managing queries on large, often complex data sets. So the first step is to create your database. So I'm just going to go to Azure Portal and click Create a Resource. Now to find what I need, I'm going to start typing database for PostgresQL. Notice the spelling. And I find Azure Database for PostgresQL. And I'll click on that. And I'll click the Create. Now it asks me for what type of server I want to create. I want to create a single server just for this demo. And now I have to fill in the basics. So I already have a resource group set up called database, which I'll use. And then I need to fill in a server name. So I'm just going to call it testdb26. I just put the 26 on the end to make it unique. Oh, that's not unique, so I'll call it 266. And I'm going to leave the rest of this default. And under administrator account, you need to give it an administrator username. My standard one is bbrooks26, and give it a password that you know. And click Review and Create. So I'm going to click Create. Now this is going to take a few minutes, so as the deployment's progressing, I'm just going to pause the video and come back when it's done. Okay, the deployment is complete, so I can click on Go to Resource. And this is my database. You see Azure Database for PostgresQL Server. Now there's one step you need to do before you can connect to this database, And that's under Overview, under SSL Enforced Status. Just click Enabled. And it takes you to some firewall settings. And under Firewall Rules, you need to click Add Current Client IP Address. And that will allow a standard firewall rule to allow access to your database. Now just at the top, click Save. Okay, and that's successfully updated. So now I can access that via the Azure Data Studio. If you don't have Azure Data Studio installed, you can find it online and simply download the installer. So it's a local application, and I have it right here. And the first step that you need to do in Azure Data Studio is to add the Postgresql extension. So go down to Extensions, which is this little block thing in the options on the left, and type in Postgresql. Notice the spelling, it's just one S before the QL. Postgresql, and click Install. Just wait for that to finish installing. Okay, that's finished. So now what I'm going to do is go to Connections, which is the little server icon on the left, and I'm going to click Add Connection. Okay, so under Connection Type, I'm going to choose PostgreSQL. Server name I need to get from Azure, so I go back to Azure Portal, and under my database, I'm going to go to Overview, and I'm going to copy the server name. That's what I paste for server name. Authentication type should be password. My username is the name of the user I created, which was bbrooks26, and the password that I entered when I created the database. One other thing with username, you have to say bbrooks26 or your username at and the name of your database. So if I go back, my database was called testdb266. Okay, and we can just use the defaults for database name. It creates a default database called Postgres. So that's fine. So click Connect. And now I'm connected. So now I can go ahead and create a query. So I'm going to click New Query. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new database. Now if I open up databases on the left, you'll see that there are a few by default. There's Azure Sys and there's Postgres. I'll create a new one called Test. And click Run, create database test. And that's successful. So on the left, if I refresh the databases, there's my test database. So up at the top, I'm going to switch to my test database, and I'm going to create a table. And I'll call the table Users. Simple table. And I need to give it some fields. So first field will be an ID field. And I'm going to use a serial type. And what that is it will automatically number the fields starting with 1. So we'll also make that not null because we need that field to be filled in. And also give it a first name, which is a string up to 255 characters, also not null, and a last name up to 255 characters, not null. I'll just format that a little bit. There we go. So that would create a table called Users. So if I click Run, that is successful. So if I open up on the left my database test and I open up tables, I should see, and I'm just going to move this, there it is, public.users. And if I expand that and look at the columns, I have ID and first name and last name. So now I'm going to put some data into that table, and I can modify this query to say insert into users, and I'm actually just going to remove some information here to make a list of fields to insert into. I don't have to insert into the ID field, and the reason being is because the serial field is automatic. It will automatically numerically number that field. So I just have to have first name, comma, last name, and I use the keyword values, and I can give a list of values. So I can say the first one, for instance, is Bob Barker, and I can even add more than that, more records. I can add Alice Smith, and one more, Susan Reynolds. Nice name. Now if I hit run, that completed successfully, so I've inserted those 3 users into my user list. Now if I want to take a look at them, I can say select star from users, and I see my 3 users, Bob Barker, Alice Smith, and Susan Reynolds. So in this video, I've shown you how to set up your own PostgresQL database. I've shown you how to connect to it using Azure Data Studio. And I've shown you how to query the database by creating a database, creating a table, populating the table, and then viewing the results of the content. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to deploy a MySQL database in Azure, and then query that database using Mysql Workbench, which is the official tool for interacting with MySQL. Now, if you're not familiar, MySQL is very easy to use, and it's one of the most popular databases for application backends. So the first step is to create the database. So I'm in Azure Portal, and I'm going to click on Create a Resource. Now to find the MySQL installation I want, I'm going to type database for MySQL, and it'll come up as Azure Database for MySQL. I'll choose that, and I'll click Create. And I have server options. I'm just going to choose single server for simplicity and click Create. And now I just have to choose some basics. So I have to choose a resource group. I already have one called database, so I'll choose that. And I need to come up with a unique server name. So I'm going to call it test-database 26. And under administrator account, I need to give it an admin account username. So I'm going to use my standard one, which is bbrooks26, and I'm going to give it a standard password that I'm familiar with. And click Review and Create. And now I'll click Create. So this is going to take a few moments to create the database. So I'm just going to pause and come back when it's done. Okay, so the deployment is complete. So I'm just going to click Go to Resource, and it'll take me to my database. So here we are, test database 26. Now there's one setup step that you need to do in order to make this accessible outside of Azure. And if you go to Overview and click under SSL Enforced Status and click Enabled, and this takes you to some firewall settings. Now under Firewall Rules, you're going to want to click Add Current Client IP Address. So this will add a firewall rule to allow you to access the database. And then click Save. Okay, so that's saved. So now we're all set up, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to MySQL Workbench. Now before I do that, I'm going to show you, in case you don't have MySQL Workbench and you'd like to do this yourself, there's a website that allows you to install it, and it's dev.mysql.com/downloads/workbench. Now if you see down here, there's a download button for Windows MSI installer. So just download the installer and run all the defaults, and you'll have the same installation that I have. So if I go to MySQL Workbench, now what I can do is go to Database in the top menu and choose Connect to Database. And then under Parameters, I can give it the details. So first I need host name. Now the host name is the server name. So if I go back to Azure and I go to Overview on my database, there's a server name. So if I copy that and then paste it for hostname and parameters in MySQL Workbench, and then my username has to be the username I can log into. So that's the username and password I created when I created the database. So that was bbrooks26 for me. and then you have to go @ sign, and then you have to give it the database name. So if I go back, my database name was test-database26. So test-database26, and I'll click OK. Now it asks me for my password, so that's my password for bbrooks26 that I entered when I created the database. And I hit OK, and now it's connecting me to MySQL. There we are, so I'm now connected to MySQL. On the left, you can see the databases, which are called schemas. And there's one, and it's sys. So I'm going to create a new one called test. So I've got a query here. I'm just filling in create database test, and I'll hit the lightning bolt, which executes the query. So at the bottom under output, I can see create database test, and I see the little check mark, so it was successful. So if I hit the refresh beside schemas on the left, I now see my database appear. Now what I need to do in order for the rest of my queries to run against that database, or that schema, is to right-click on it and choose it as a default schema. Set as default schema. Now everything I run will run under that. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a table under that schema. And here is my table query. Create table users. In round brackets, I have some fields. An ID field, which is serial, which means that it'll automatically numerically update, not null. First name is a string up to 255 characters, also not null. And last name is a string up to 255 characters, also not null. And finally, I have an age, which is an integer that's not null. So if I simply hit the execute, and it says at the bottom that my create table users succeeded. So if I right-click on tables under test to the left, and I hit refresh all, now when I open up tables, I see users. And if I open up users and I open up columns, I see my columns. ID, first name, last name, age, those are all my fields. Okay, so now I want to insert some information. So here I'm going to put another query, insert into users, and I'm inserting first name, last name. I also need to add age. So I will add an age to each of these, and I have 3 records, one for Bob Barker, one for Alice Smith, and one for Susan Reynolds. So I'll make Bob Barker, I'll put it 45, Alice Smith, I'll make her 16, and Susan Reynolds is 54. So if I hit execute, okay, it tells me at the bottom under output that that succeeded. So now I have information in my table, data in my table, so now I can select that data and see it. So I'm going to add a new query, which is select star from users. So if I execute that, so now in the result grid just below the query, I now see my results. You notice, as I've mentioned, the ID field automatically updates with the next number in the numerically as I enter new records. So I have Bob Barker 45, Alice Smith 16, Susan Reynolds 54. So in conclusion, what I've done here is I've created a MySQL database in Azure. It was very easy. And I've connected Mysql Workbench, which is a standard tool for MySQL. And I was able to query, create a database, create a table, populate the table, and select the data out of the table. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to deploy a Mariadb database in Azure and query that database using Mysql Workbench. Now, Mariadb is a free, community-developed database engine that's highly compatible with MySQL. It can support a lot of different storage engines in the back end, and in some cases is more performant than MySQL. So the first step is to create the database. So I'm in Microsoft Azure portal, and I'm going to click on Create a Resource. Now, the way that I find what I want is I start typing in database for Mariadb. And one of the options will be Azure Database for Mariadb. So click on that one, and then click Create. And I need to fill in the basics here, so I'm on my free trial subscription in this case, but whatever subscription you're on, you have to choose a resource group. So I chose my resource group that already exists, which is database. And I'm just going to leave the server details as they are. And I'm going to put in my standard admin username, which is, for me, bbrooks26. And I'll put in a password that I use. And one thing I skipped over on server details, I do have to fill in a server name. So just as a unique server name, I'm going to call this test-server26. And I'll click Review and Create, and then click Create. Now this is going to take possibly a few minutes, so I'm just going to pause the video and come back when it's finished. Okay, so the deployment is complete, and I can click Go to Resource, and it'll take me to my database. So here's my database, Azure Database for Mariadb Server, Test Server 26. Now there's one step you have to do before you can connect to this database. Under Overview, just go to SSL Enforce Status and click Enabled, and it'll take you to some firewall settings. And under Firewall Rules, you want to click Add Current Client IP Address, and then click Save. Okay, and that's successfully saved. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Mysql Workbench. Now if you don't have Mysql Workbench installed, it's just a local program that you can find online, and it's a very simple installation. So just search Mysql Workbench online, and you'll find the main site that has an MSI that you can download and just run. And just choose the defaults and you have it installed in your machine. So interestingly enough, there is a bug in this version of Mysql Workbench, and I'm using version 8.0. So if you're using version 8.0 with the latest release, there is a bug that I've discovered where if you try to connect to a Mariadb database by going Database, Connect to Database, what happens is when you fill in the information and you hit OK, it actually crashes the program. So there is a workaround, and that is under Database, instead of doing Connect to Database, you can do Manage Connections. Another simpler way to do that is on the main page here, on the Connections page, you can click the plus sign beside MySQL Connections. And you can fill it in. And this will actually work. So I'm going to create one called Mariadb. Now to get the host name and the username, I have to go back to Azure. So if I go back to Azure and on my database, if I go to Overview, there's a server name in Overview. I will copy that. And then in MySQL, I can paste that as host name. Now back to Azure, there's a server admin login name. I can copy that. And in Setup New Connection, I can put that as username. And then hit OK. And you can see on the connection page, I called it Mariadb, and I can click on that and it'll try to connect. Now it asks me for my password. Now that's the password for the user, which I entered when I created the database. So I just type that in, hit OK, and it's connecting. Now this is the part that would crash if you tried to just connect directly to the database. There seems to be an error that when this pop-up window comes up, it would crash the system. So doing it this way, it doesn't crash it. So I can click Continue anyway. So what I'm going to do now that I have a query window is I'm going to create a new database. So I'm just going to type in Create Database, and I'm just going to call it Test. And I'll click the Execute little lightning bolt above it. And down in my output, it says Create Database Test, and it's successful. So on schemas to the left, if I just hit refresh, I now see my test database. Now I'm going to create a table in that database, but first I have to make that database my default. So if I right-click on Test under Schemas, and I choose Set as Default Schema, and this means that all the queries that I do will actually affect that schema or that database. So I'm going to create a table called Users. And Users is going to have a few fields. The first field is going to be an ID, and I'm going to make it type serial, and that just means that the ID is numeric, and every time I add a new record into the table, it's just going to use the next number in the series. That's not null because I want that to be required. And a person is going to have a first name, which is a string of up to 255 characters, also required, and a last name with the same thing. It's going to be a string of 255 characters, required. So now I can just hit execute, and you see in the output at the bottom it's now created the table. So if I go to the left and I go under test schema and I right click on tables and I go refresh all, now I can now open the tables and there's my users table. And if I open the users table, I can see the columns that I've just created: ID, first name, last name. All right, so my next step is to add data in this table. So I will insert into users. Now I need to specify the fields that I'm going to insert into. So I'm going to insert into first name and last name. Notice I don't have to say ID because ID is an automatic field. It's a serial type field, so it fills it in automatically. And then I use the keyword values. And then I can give the values for the different records. So maybe we have someone named Joe Smith. And we can also add a few more. So I'll just create a couple of records this way. So there's a Joe Smith, there's a Susan Redding, and there is a Stanley Hudson. And now I can click execute. And you see in my output at the bottom, it's now inserted the users. So now I should be able to query those users. So I can select star from users and hit query. And here are my users in the result grid: Joe Smith, Susan Redding, and Stanley Hudson. So just to summarize, what I've shown you here is how to create a Mariadb database in Azure and how to connect with it using Mysql Workbench. And then I've shown you how to create a database, create a table, populate that table, and then query that table. So in this course, we've examined querying techniques for data using SQL language, data definition language, and data manipulation language. We did this by exploring structured query, data definition, and data manipulation languages, querying Azure SQL database using Azure Portal, SQL Server Management Studio, Data Studio, and SQL Command utility, and querying relation data in Postgresql, MySQL, and Mariadb. In our next course, we'll move on to explore non-relational data workloads.